Chapter 9 of the late Mr. Jonathan Wild the Great. This recording is in the public domain. Read by Dennis Sayers. The late Mr. Jonathan Wild the Great, by Henry Fielding. Book 2, Chapter 9. More Greatness in Wild. A low scene between Mrs. Heartfree and her children, and a scheme of our hero worthy the highest admiration and even astonishment. When first Wild conducted his flame, or rather his dish, to continue our metaphor, from the proprietor, he had projected a design of conveying her to one of those eating houses in Covent Garden, where female flesh is deliciously dressed and served up to the greedy appetites of young gentlemen. But fearing lest she should not come readily enough into his wishes, and that by too eager and hasty a pursuit he should frustrate his future expectations, and luckily at the same time a noble hint suggesting itself to him, by which he might almost inevitably secure his pleasure together with his profit, he contented himself with waiting on Mrs. Heartfree home, and after many protestations of friendship and service to her husband, took his leave, and promised to visit her early in the morning, and to conduct her back to Mr. Snap's. Wild now retired to a night cellar, where he found several of his acquaintance, with whom he spent the remaining part of the night in revelling, nor did the least compassion for Heartfree's misfortunes disturb the pleasure of his cups. So truly great was his soul, that it was absolutely composed, save that an apprehension of Miss Tishy's making some discovery, as she was then in no good temper towards him, a little ruffled and disquieted the perfect serenity he would otherwise have enjoyed. As he had, therefore, no opportunity of seeing her that evening, he wrote her a letter full of 10,000 protestations of honourable love, and, which he more depended on, containing as many promises, in order to bring the young lady into good humour, without acquainting her in the least with his suspicion, or giving her any caution. For it was his constant maxim never to put it into any one's head to do you a mischief by acquainting him that it is in his power. We must now return to Mrs. Heartfree, who passed a sleepless night in as great agonies and horror for the absence of her husband as a fine well-bred woman would feel at the return of hers from a long voyage or journey. In the morning, the children being brought to her, the eldest asked where dear papa was, at which she could not refrain from bursting into tears. The child, perceiving it, said, "Don't cry, mamma. I am sure papa would not stay abroad if he could help it." At these words she caught the child in her arms, and throwing herself into the chair in an agony of passion, cried out, "No, my child, nor shall all the malice of hell keep us long asunder." These are circumstances which we should not, for the amusement of 6 or 7 readers only, have inserted, had they not served to show that there are weaknesses in vulgar life to which great minds are so entirely strangers that they have not even an idea of them; and secondly, by exposing the folly of this low creature to set off and elevate that greatest of which we endeavour to draw a true portrait in this history. Wild, entering the room, found the mother with one child in her arms, and the other at her knee. After paying her his compliments, he desired her to dismiss the children and servant, for that he had something of the greatest moment to impart to her. She immediately complied with his request, and, the door being shut, asked him with great eagerness if he had succeeded in his intentions of procuring the bail. He answered he had not endeavoured at it yet, for a scheme had entered into his head by which she might certainly preserve her husband, herself, and her family, in order to which he advised her instantly to remove with the most valuable jewels she had to Holland, before any statute of bankruptcy issued to prevent her, that he would himself attend her thither and place her in safety, and then return to deliver her husband, who would be thus easily able to satisfy his creditors. He added that he was that instant come from Snap's, where he had communicated the scheme to Heartfree, who had greatly approved of it, and desired her to put it in execution without delay, concluding that a moment was not to be lost. The mention of her husband's approbation left no doubt in this poor woman's breast. She only desired a moment's time to pay him a visit in order to take her leave, but Wild peremptorily refused. He said by every moment's delay she risked the ruin of her family, that she would be absent only a few days from him, for that the moment he had lodged her safe in Holland he would return, procure her husband his liberty, and bring him to her. I have been the unfortunate, the innocent cause of all my dear Tom's calamity, madam, said he, and I will perish with him or see him out of it. Mrs. Heartfree overflowed with acknowledgments of his goodness, but still begged for the shortest interview with her husband. Wild declared that a minute's delay might be fatal, and added, though with the voice of sorrow rather than of anger, that if she had not resolution enough to execute the commands he brought her from her husband, his ruin would lie at her door, and, for his own part, he must give up any farther meddling in his affairs. She then proposed to take her children with her, but Wild would not permit it, saying they would only retard their flight, and that it would be properer for her husband to bring them. He at length absolutely prevailed on this poor woman, who immediately packed up the most valuable effects she could find, and after taking a tender leave of her infants, earnestly recommended them to the care of a very faithful servant. Then they called a hackney coach, which conveyed them to an inn, where they were furnished with a chariot and six, in which they set forward for Harwich. Wild rode with an exulting heart, secure, as he now thought himself, of the possession of that lovely woman, together with a rich cargo. In short, he enjoyed in his mind all the happiness which unbridled lust and rapacious avarice could promise him. As to the poor creature who was to satisfy these passions, her whole soul was employed in reflecting on the condition of her husband and children. A single word scarce escaped her lips, though many a tear gushed from her brilliant eyes, which, if I may use a coarse expression, served only as delicious sauce to heighten the appetite of Wild. End of Book 2, Chapter 9. Read by Dennis Sayers in Modesto, California, for LibriVox.